I think we all have to agree the idea that he wouldn't go after Joe Biden, not just at the end of the campaign, but I do note in the book there are numerous points in the campaign where that option was pushed by staff and pushed by others. And look, I think that's a fair critique. I think he has an internal monologue that is very self-critical, but I don't think he engages in that self-critique with anybody else. There are very few people who have insight to who he is. And I felt that telling that insight was very important. It was also important for me, for the book, to reflect the reality that I saw out on the road.
I'm also curious what you make of the Congressional Progressive Caucus's endorsement of Shontel Brown over Nina Turner.
It disgusted me, to be honest.
I am so glad to be joined back on the podcast for the second time by my former colleague on the Bernie Sanders 2020 campaign, Rabin-Havt. Welcome back.
Hey, Brianna, how you doing?
I'm doing so well, and I was so thrilled to be able to read your book, newly out, The Fighting Soul on the Road with Bernie Sanders. Finished it this morning. It was terrific in all of the best ways, Ari. It took me back to 2019, 2020. And I'm eager to talk to you about it because you have some excerpts from the book have been making the rounds and are dovetailing really nicely with news out this past week that Bernie says he hasn't ruled out running in 2024 if Biden isn't going to run. I can't think of anybody better to ask about this than you. Does all of this amount to nothing since it's all but certain that Biden is going to run, or is there a there?
I always am like, who the hell knows? If you would ask me, like, when I finished the book, and it's kind of clear from the tone, like, I didn't believe it was a possibility that he would run again. But then there's the story in the book I tell about when he cut his head open in South Carolina, and then a week later they take the stitches out and there's no scar. And like, how does he have no scar from 7 stitches after a week? Like, that's not. He's kind of inhuman in that way. And like this weekend, you see him out doing the thing he actually loves doing, going to like Amazon with the workers, going to Richmond. What other politician is out there doing, 2 stops, 1 day, 2 different states, flying around? So he's clearly got the energy for it. And I mean, I don't know what happens with Joe Biden. I mean, he very much said, I'm not running against Joe Biden.
Right.
But who knows what happens with Joe Biden? I mean, I just think.
Thing. Even saying I'm not, even this whole thing being kind of conditional on whether or not Joe Biden runs brings people back to some aspects of the 2020 campaign in a bad way, which is this idea that a lot of people have that, but for his kind of warm feelings toward Joe Biden, his the lack of kind of visceral apathy that existed with Hillary Clinton. If there had been
or with
more
Mayor
incisive,
Pete, as I point out in the book,
or with Mayor Pete, if he had really gone for the jugular, then we could have had a different outcome. And some people are frustrated that he's still evincing a certain level of deference for Joe Biden, which seems out of step with the calls to action and the way that he so pointedly described the moment as requiring more than what Joe Biden was offering, not just in the context of 2019, but in the context of the emerging pandemic at the beginning of 2020. What do you make of that critique?
I don't think it's unfair. And I think I try to so the goal of the book was to kind of give a real portrait of who he was. Mm-hmm. And I think we all have to agree the idea that he wouldn't go after Joe Biden, not just at the end of the campaign, but I do note in the book there are numerous points in the campaign where that option was pushed by staff and pushed by others and put out there. And I think that's a fair critique. But it's also not what I would expect him to do because it would fall out of pattern with what he's done. He clearly, on 2 levels. One, I think, I think people can critique these levels, these 2 things. One is he very much as he casts himself as outside the Democratic Party, he does try to work within the Democratic Party. And that means to him not really aggressively going at a president of the Democratic Party in that way, or the Democratic nominee. And
so why even say it is what some people are asking. Why even float it? If Joe Biden's going to run anyway, why even float that you would be willing to run? Because to some people it says, oh, you're just trying to gin up interest among progressives who feel really disaffected and disengaged from electoralism. Remind them what the party could offer, remind them how excited they were about the Bernie Sanders movement, and get them to pay attention as we head into what's slated to be a really tough midterm season for Democrats.
Can I be honest with you?
Yeah,
I did not understand what the broader point was there. Because in some cases, why are you putting this out for 2024 when, as you said, if you were to be an odds better right now, Joe Biden's going to run again, and you've kind of discounted that. I did not understand the kind of driving strategic point of that memo. In that the other piece is the whole memo was written out. It talked about his visits to Richmond. It talked about what he was doing with workers. It talked about kind of a broader political strategy for 2022. And the problem is that memo, then there's this one line at the bottom that's the line that everybody's highlighted. And look, the people around him who do media are smart enough to know that that's the line that's going to get attention if they put something like that out. I'm sure there was a thought process. I don't even want to critique it because I don't understand it and I have no insight into it.
So, I mean, one could argue that it's a smart bid to get people to pay attention to the memo and all the other things that Bernie is engaged with by putting that little teaser in there. And surely enough, Bernie is, did in the last couple of days appear with Chris Smalls and AOC at Amazon protests in a way that garnered a lot of media attention. And I think people feel like it was a really beautiful moment of solidarity that reminds them of why they liked the campaign so much. But also, Ari, in reading this, I was taken aback in so many ways. I was taken back to a world where we were all friends. Everybody on the left were friends again.
You mean broadly? We were all
broadly, because you and I are, and we're unmarred. But the broader left community, events being described with Senator Turner and Pramila Jayapal and Ro Khanna and everybody, and AOC, and everybody's one big happy family. And so before I wanted to get more into the details of the book, I'm also curious what you make of the latest evidence that we no longer live in that universe, which is the CPC, the Congressional Progressive Caucus's endorsement of Shontel Brown over Nina Turner. As someone from the heart of Bernie world, what do you make of that choice? Bernie obviously has endorsed S&T.
I was honestly disgusted by it. I tend to be somebody who generally likes Pramila Jayapal, generally thinks she's been a good leader for the CPC. But that to me, you have a leader like Senator Turner running. You have somebody who is constantly led on progressive issues versus a candidate like Shontel Brown. And this has been the longstanding problem with the Progressive Caucus. We're the largest caucus in Congress. I would often critique that. That means there are too many people and you're defining progressive too wide. And look, I think you have a candidate being supported by some of the worst super PACs out there. You have a candidate who has not signed on, as far as I know, in Congress to a bunch of the climate change legislation that I would take as a very basic step to being progressive. Put everything else aside, you have somebody who will be a fighter for progressive causes versus somebody who, frankly, has had months and not even been a tepid progressive as far as I see. And the fact that the Progressive Caucus, I would get if they said, we're not endorsing in this race because we're not endorsing against a member. We're just going to sit this one out. I think that's cowardly, but at least I understand it. I don't understand how the Progressive Caucus, what they think they're getting by endorsing clearly the less progressive candidate in the race. And against somebody like Senator Turner, who, by the way, would be a spectacular member of Congress, would be kind of the progressive ideal, who would just be such a huge fighter on everything we believe in. It disgusted me, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, and to your point about Shontel Brown being funded by some of the worst members of the race, I had forgotten that DMFI, who has supported Shontel Brown in the last run, really bringing her up to Nita Turner's fundraising levels in the race last summer, weighed in against Bernie in Iowa as well. And those kind of details were really interesting to revisit as I read the book. Now, Ari, one of the narratives that I wasn't as familiar with until I reread your account was how much evidence there was earlier on that Elizabeth Warren was not going to be that strong a candidate. You talk about her poor fundraising numbers after her launch in December of 2019, and the campaign's early realization that it wasn't about kind of like a progressive wing and a more moderate wing or conservative wing of the Democratic Party, that it was this beer track, wine track, and that she was competing with other folks on her wine track, whereas it became clearer, I think, to the campaign than it did to the public at large early on, that it was Bernie and Biden that were competing for the same kinds of voters. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that story began to change as we headed into that summer where Elizabeth Warren gained a little traction, and ultimately what you think happened there, what lessons are to be learned from that?
Yeah, I think Elizabeth Warren, we saw the launch, which you bring up, where she goes to Council Bluffs, Iowa, and which the secret of Iowa rallies are. Council Bluffs is where you have your largest rallies, because it's just outside of Omaha. You literally just cross a bridge and you're in Council Bluffs. And Omaha has a rather large, actually, progressive and Democratic population who get very excited when Democrats are there. So when Bernie has a rally in Council Bluffs, you're talking, I think our first rally was over 2,000 people, right? Which in Iowa was a big rally. Elizabeth Warren goes there, and I see the venue she's at, and they're like, we blew out the doors on this venue, but the venue's a tiny venue that holds a few hundred people. So blowing out the doors, there wasn't the huge response of this, emerging candidate who has all this press coming out. And I just expected bigger. And then we saw her initial fundraising numbers because of the way Act Blue was tracking. We kind of had, at that point, almost daily insight into fundraising numbers. And it just was weak. And we were sitting there going, okay, that campaign didn't launch super strong, as opposed, by the way, to Kamala Harris, where we looked at her launch. And her launch actually was very, very strong. But then we start seeing among voters, and we actually saw this a year before when we did a first initial polling in Iowa. We saw that basically when Bernie's electoral coalition against Hillary was one thing, it kind of got all the anti-Hillary folks and the entirety of the center left of the Democratic Party, meaning the intellectual left class, not people we would describe as leftists, more the liberal wing of the Democratic Party joined in. What we saw was that section, Warren supporters, kind of broke off that section of Bernie supporters. And if Elizabeth Warren wasn't in the race at the beginning, would they have supported Bernie? Probably. But they were a section that, as the race progressed, very clearly were much more aligned, much more likely to go vote for a Pete Buttigieg or an Amy Klobuchar, whereas our voters and Joe Biden's voters, you could seek in Iowa especially cross, and it was a class issue in a lot of cases where our voters were poorer, were much more working class, were less educated. And by the way, we're also much more heavily brown than than her voters. And
yeah,
by the way,
say it again. Say it louder, Ari, for the people in the cheap seats, because I will never forget. I will never forget the day the New York Times co-endorsed Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar, and the two of them combined had 10% of the Black vote combined. And there was none of this hand wringing about, oh my gosh, what does it mean to support people who Black people don't like? When Bernie Sanders consistently throughout the entire campaign was number 2 with Black voters, and even for a period of time in February of 2020, eclipsed Joe Biden with Black voters.
And number 1 with Latino voters.
Right.
And so
right.
Our vote, that was just a voter, and her voters were much more likely to like a Pete Buttigieg. Whereas our voters and Pete Buttigieg, there was no, if you did a Venn diagram, we did not have any overlap with Mayor Pete voters. Like it was like completely separated. Whereas you had a lot of voters who were Bernie Biden voters, which is how you see so many Biden voters. If you look at the details, like supporting Medicare for all, that was where that crossover was, where there was a number of voters who would cross that way based on kind of class orientation.
Yeah. Which kind of begs the question, why not emphasize more that Joe Biden fundamentally was opposed to Medicare for all, not just ideologically, but pointing to the huge number of donations he'd gotten from pharmaceutical interests and the like, that really, I think, explained his antipathy for the policy.
Well, the question between Joe Biden and Bernie voters, those crossover voters, was they just had a fundamental belief. They knew they disagreed with Biden on issues. They had a fundamental belief that Biden could win, and that media was telling them Biden could win, and he was the old standard candidate who they felt was like the safer bet. Like that was part of the problem. Biden, for them, represented the safe choice, and the lack of attacks. And I think where this critique comes from is without the kind of attacks, Biden stays the safe choice, right? In the primary. And that's kind of where it's less an ideology of Medicare for all. It's more he remains the safe choice unless you attack him.
Unless you attack him. So this conversation about, why not attack is one of the lingering conversations from the campaign that hasn't quite gone away. You see periodically people bringing up the moment with Zephyr Teachout publishing that article about Joe Biden's corruption in the campaign. So that conversation is still ongoing. And I've noticed that there's a different little bit of a flavor that's come up. This argument that I've seen come up recently. And apparently it's because of something that Ezra Klein has written in his book. And I wonder if you've heard this. People are saying that the real issue was not just that Bernie refused to go more on the offensive, but that there was a shift in the tone of his language that emphasized racism, bigotry, and identity politics too much. And while I would agree with an argument that says he de-emphasized some of the talk about corruption that was really salient in 2016 and really mobilized people in 2016, people are putting those things against each other and saying it's not just that he talked about corruption too little, it's that he talked about, identity issues too much at the expense of those corruption issues. And so it doesn't just make an enemy. It's not just a critique of Bernie Sanders for not doing one thing enough. It actually makes an enemy of talking about identity issues. And I wonder what you make of that critique.
I think one of the problems we faced in this primary was a media and opponents who were constantly talking about identity issues. So we had Bernie, who never shied from addressing those fundamental economic issues. He did pull his punches with other Democrats on the corruption thing, and I think that is a legit critique. And he did, because he did pull his punches on some of the corruption and money stuff. He did bring them out on occasion, as I note in the book. We step into New Hampshire, Pete Buttigieg is gaining. He steps up at the Politics and Eggs breakfast with literally a list of stuff about Pete's billionaire donors and just starts in front of the entire press corps at this giant political event the night before the debate, just starts reading off about basically Pete Buttigieg's corruption, donor corruption. So he didn't shy with Pete. He obviously did hesitate with Biden. I think when it comes to the Ezra Klein critique, I fundamentally disagree with Ezra in that I think Bernie would Bernie prefer a race based on kind of his fundamental economic and corruption issues that he's very kind of his home base. Yes, but it would have been utterly impossible in a 2020 Democratic field not to talk about those other issues at all. It would have meant it just wasn't functionally possible. Those were the questions he was getting from the press. Those were the questions at debates. Those were the questions like at different forums. And you could say, I guess you could say he could refuse to answer those questions and refuse to debate and refuse to do this. But then then the narrative would have been Bernie Sanders is scared to discuss these issues so it's not like the core of his stump was an identity core. No, he continued to talk about class. I think where he was talking about these other issues tended to be where he was frankly responding. And to be honest, that's what the press wanted to talk about. It's one of the reasons, by the way, I don't really address this in the book, but a constant kind of argument with the press on the road was this constant, why isn't Bernie gaggling with us every day? And the reason Bernie didn't want to gaggle with people every day was because he had a message. And if he gaggled, they would ask about whatever stupid thing was going on in the news that really was what I used to call a fart sniffing issue, meaning it's just people who want to inhale their own gases to talk about and not talk about kind of those fundamental economic issues. Whereas, by the way, that's where we would sometimes have to get creative, sometimes do other things, but it created actually a lot of tension with the press because we weren't talking about enough about those identity issues. And look, yes, if it was Bernie's choice, and I think if it was the campaign's choice, there would have been a lot less of those, I shouldn't say a lot less of, I should say a lot more focus on fundamental economic issues in the press corps, but that wasn't the reality of this race.
Yeah, it does strike me that people are making a lot of a boilerplate paragraph, not even like 2 sentences at the top of speeches that say, and I'm going to fight for Blacks and Latinos and Asians and LGBT. And it's like, if you think that a coalition can't be built because someone does like a pro forma acknowledgement of the reality that we live in a pluralistic society, then I think I think an extremely dangerous claim to make.
And I think the problem there was people were lying about him. And there was this lie that when Bernie says working class, he's only talking about white people. No, he's not. He's literally talking about the working class in this country, which is primarily people of color, by the way.
Right.
And he felt the need to have to say that, I think, to make it clear, because if he didn't, there was this lie repeated that, oh, he's only talking about white people, which just wasn't true.
But also just, Ari, it's more basic than that. If I go to New York, I'm going to say, hello, New Yorkers.
Yes. Yeah.
If I go to a steel plant, I'm going to say, hello, steel workers. And if I'm standing in front of a pluralistic crowd of people asking a country to vote for me to be the president of the United States, I'm going to acknowledge the affinity groups along which, like it or not, many people identify. And it was very brief and pro forma. And I have now heard this parroted by so many people all over the place, including people who at one time were critical of Bernie Sanders for talking insufficiently about identity and pointing to those very kind of pro forma and superficial statements as evidence of why he didn't do better. And while I fully agree that there should have been more of the corruption talk, acting like those two things are mutually exclusive, is I think so dangerous that I just want to take a moment to make that point known. Because if you think that those are mutually exclusive, you're getting into a place where you have to choose a kind of, frankly, faux populist, nativist white fascism that is a superficial working class politics, or a kind of empty identity politics, and that is the divide that is emerging or has emerged in this country. And I don't know why Bernie people are feeding into it.
And Bernie would argue you need to have both. The Rainbow Coalition vision that kind of formulated his kind of modern political ideology coming out of Jesse Jackson it's this combo of race and class. It's kind of also what Reverend Barber speaks about. It's the combo of the two where you get the real power and traction. You can't do one without the other.
So I want to ask you, Ari, because you make a point of saying in the book how loyal, and efficient and good Bernie's staff is, particularly the advanced staff. In many ways, this is a love letter to the advanced team, who are the people who advance an event, who set up an event, who scout out a location before Bernie arrives, who make sure that everything runs smoothly throughout and who are largely invisible in the context of the campaign. You tell the story of Bernie hitting his head on a glass shower door and having to be rushed to the hospital for stitches with a vividness that I think most people haven't seen before. All the blood that's on the floor of the hotel room that you end up having to clean up with, I think, Terrell and pass off the Terrell Champion, who was at the time Bernie's body man and later joined the policy team, and later pass off to a member of the advance team, Charla, who went off and burned the bloody towels and has to date never told anybody where she pulled all of this off. I mean, these are
I saw her, I was with her a few weeks ago. And she still won't tell me what she did with the towels.
I mean, it's an incredible story and very vivid. And the point that you make is that, despite all of that going on, it was hardly a blip on the media radar. I mean, there were some jokes made about Bernie having that big old bandage on his head for a second there. But that it really speaks to the how competent and loyal the advance team was. And so I want to ask you, why now? What was the process like of making the decision to write a book that contains some of these intimacies and details that previously have not been public?
I had a very, I really wanted to think out the process of this book. And I saw a bunch of books in process that were going to tell the story of 2020. And to me, it was very important that there was a telling of the Bernie story that at least came from a Bernie perspective. I also felt like that I had to be loyal to Bernie. So there were lines that in my own mind I drew where, look, I was as you know, I was intimately close with him for a number of years. And there are things that I felt were not, public business and would never put in a book because they're not for that. And then there are things that I kind of drew. I think there are things that really help to highlight the character. The goal was, here is this person who is, I believe, one of the most important figures, at least of the 20th and 21st century, not to be elected president in US politics. Somebody who has shifted kind of some realities that undergirded politics before he existed and have shifted them completely. And there are very few people who have insight to who he is. And I felt that telling that insight was very important. It was also important for me, for the book, to reflect the reality that I saw out on the road. And the reality that I saw in the campaign. And look, I think there are things where people can have differences of opinion from this book, and I'm happy to hear other opinions, to be honest, of things. But I also felt like having this story out there, having a first draft of history written by, frankly, I'm the one person who saw this race from start to finish, the closest to Bernie's eyes you could have, because I was just with him so much. And I felt it was an important story to tell for his own legacy.
Do you know if, has Bernie read the book?
I don't know. I sent him an early draft, but I don't know if he's read the book.
I'm curious whether and to what extent he's engaged with any of what I think at this point are pretty widely understood critiques, that there is, the flip side of him being so steady and consistent and committed to his message was that he had this kind of Virgo inflexibility on the campaign, and unwillingness to kind of delegate and let things go from time to time, and over, focus, as you describe, as being involved with small decisions that shouldn't have concerned him, concerns about, spending too much money, staffing up too much, too fast.
The Chuck Rocha bumper sticker story.
Right, which is go ahead and tell that story.
He was at one point, in terms of management, he got the first round of bumper stickers came, and he had the bumper stickers and he was complaining that it wasn't sticky enough, and he literally took the bumper sticker and slapped it to his desk and then peeled it up, and he was like, it can't come up. And he called Chuck Rocha, who one of Chuck's responsibilities was printed material, and was basically like, Chuck, you got to order new stickers. They have to stick better. The stickers aren't sticky enough.
So I'm curious. I mean, that's a rather innocuous version of that. But the less innocuous version is us sitting there terrified in the summer of 2019 as Elizabeth Warren was gaining steam because her policy team was organized and able to roll out new policy agendas in a way that could really capitalize in a news cycle. And we were being framed as being beaten on all of these left issues because we couldn't predict when Bernie was going to okay a certain kind of rollout, and there wasn't the ability to coordinate with the comms department in that same sort of way. And that felt very scary. The idea that we would lose a battle where we weren't even substantively behind Elizabeth Warren just because of, that kind of inflexibility or unwillingness to delegate or whatever you want to describe it. And I wonder if you've ever known Bernie to engage in any of those criticisms of himself.
Not really, actually. I think I think he has an internal monologue that is very self-critical, and it causes him, but I don't think he engages in that self-critique with anybody else. I've never seen him engage in that self-critique. And look, on the policy thing, you're right. Like I'm very critical in the book, and I think of kind of decisions that Bernie made in the spring of 2019 that kind of disabled our policy shop basically until the summer, until those decisions were kind of reversed. And
you mean sending Josh Orton back to the Senate?
Yes. But also just not building a policy team. It was, and I think reversing that and building a policy team allowed us to start a process that started delivering policies. But that was a major down point in the campaign. I think in the spring, and I kind of list them in the book. There's like a series of bad moments that put us behind. Then there's that handicapping of ourselves that we don't really recover from until October. And I think Bernie is very sure of who he is. And I think he is very clear about who he is, even when those closest to him don't understand what the rationale behind his decisions are sometimes. He's not, but it's also part of what we love about him. Like I tell the story in the book of the James Clyburn fish fry, right? Where, and this is another small issue, but I think it highlights this thing where every other candidate's putting on the James Clyburn t-shirt. I'm alone with him backstage, and he put on the t-shirt, he took it off. He's like, no, I look stupid in this. I'm not doing this. And I'm sitting there trying to convince him that every other candidate is doing it and you have to do it. He's like, no, stop. There's a point where I knew I hit my limit with him, where I can ask like a few times, and you were around me sometimes where you saw me hit the limit where it's like I can't push any further because the conversation's done. It was one of those, the Clyburn staff is sitting there like eyeing me down and being like, what's your boss doing? Da 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 da. And in those moments, you have a voice in the back of your head that kind of wishes your candidate, you wish your candidate was like Pete Buttigieg, who would just, you could program like a mindless automaton to go out and like deliver the thing. But then that's also what draws us to Bernie, is the fact that he is who he is. And the reason he can take the positions and be the politician he is because he's not one who just listens to staff and goes along with it. And that led to moments in the campaign that were, bad moments for us, right? Where he should have listened and he didn't. But also, he's not the politician he would be if he did. Like, if he just mindlessly listened to us, like sometimes we wish he would, he wouldn't be Bernie. And that's the kind of secret and part of the internal struggle within him.
Mari, do you sometimes feel like, and I'm trying to be honest with myself about this.
Yeah.
Do you feel like sometimes we paint that as the duality of Bernie? We all say like that's the two sides, and you got to take the bitter with the sweet. Does that ultimately let him off the hook as someone who has now run twice, and even if it's just largely performative, is talking about the possibility of running again? if this were Hillary Clinton and she's writing, what had happened, what really happened, whatever. And she had this, unwillingness to really engage with any substantive criticisms of herself in that book, right? We all laughed about it and rolled our eyes. You even tell an anecdote in your book about, I think Hillary Clinton. Was it Hillary Clinton? Was it from her own book, or
No,
was it an interview she had given?
It was from I think, the Jonathan Allen book he was reading. He was sitting there like laughing, and I couldn't figure out like why he was laughing. And it turned out he was reading the Jonathan Allen book about 2016.
Bernie was. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And he just looks at me and he said something like, can you imagine it took 5 people to tell someone why they're running for president? And
right. And so we all feel that way about Hillary Clinton. Like, to date, she's doing these master classes and giving these interviews that show just a complete lack of self-awareness. And I wonder if we are not holding Bernie to a sufficiently high standard, because for obvious reasons, he is substantively, ethically, morally, politically her superior in every way. But, would he be a better politician, a better candidate, a better senator if we were more honest about the ways that personality, that aspect of his personality, really impeded the campaign in meaningful ways? And not just the kind of Virgo-y, attention to detail, but also the many moments in the story that come up where he has this personal affection for Joe Biden. There's a moment at the luggage carousel with Amy Klobuchar where you describe a real, genuine, appreciation for Amy Klobuchar as a politician. As a reader, as a supporter, some people might read that and say, well, that's a real personality defect. That's a real political defect that came between him and being as pointed as he needed to be in his attacks to win.
I think the Amy Klobuchar thing, I slightly disagree with you on, because he kind of would very much acknowledge their ideological disagreement and just admire how skilled she was. Is like, the story was we were in an airport. We had both arrived in Minnesota. This is 2018, before the presidential campaign. We were waiting for the carousel, and Amy Klobuchar's insisting she has to drive us to the airport. And she's kind of taking Bernie around the airport, and she just knows like every random guy in the airport. Amy Klobuchar's like, this is this person, like no prep, just as, and Bernie kind of just admired that political ability while acknowledging ideologically they were like very separate. I think that's one thing. I think the Joe Biden thing, which we come back to, was a significant, I think, issue. I think, do we let him off the hook? The problem is, I think, had he been a politician who spent 30 years listening to advisors, right, and not going off his own instinct, and not always going his own way, and not leading his own charge, he would never have been Bernie. So you have 25 years of built-in, I'm my own best advisor in his core. And I don't know how he escapes that to run for president. And if he had run for president without that and followed the advice of every political advisor for 30 years, he would have been a generic Martin O'Malley Democrat, right? But that's not who he was. He wasn't going to become a Democrat. He wasn't going to kind of go with his flow. And I say this in the book, part of Bernie that I think is unrecognized a lot of the time is Bernie's ideology extends past policy beliefs. He has a very specific idea about how politics should work that is very different, and I think gets at the root of a lot of what you're talking about right now that could lead him in directions that I think everyone around saw as not the most helpful thing to the campaign. I don't know if you get the Bernie that we all love without that. I really don't know if you get that without that.
That's the thing. All right. That's the part that I feel like is letting him off the hook, because we're not going to sit here and pretend that there weren't some concessions made. It's not as though Bernie never attended any event. It's not that he didn't put the T-shirt on ultimately for the photo op with all of the candidates. Concessions are being made. Some understanding of needing to call, you talk about how he was frustrated having to do it, but that you have to reach out to the grass tops, as it were, the leaders of grassroots movement, so you don't get this constant Twitter in the press about how he's just, this candidate has disrespected this interest group and that interest group, when really he hasn't disrespected any voters. He just hasn't glad-handed with the leader of that interest group or the perceived leader of that interest group that went and then complained to the press, right? So there's an understanding that certain things have to be done and certain things were done, including improving on mistakes that were made in 2016. So on one hand, it does, we all appreciate that there are lines in the sand, that Bernie has an internal litmus test when it's an important issue, like, Medicare for all. He's never going to Kamala Harris that one.
No.
Or Pete Buttigieg
or Elizabeth Warren that one. Let's be honest about that.
110%. But sometimes it feels like, well, we default into an extremist view of like, well, he had to maintain his integrity so he couldn't XYZ, when the stakes that we're talking about are much less than those ultimate compromises.
No, and I think on an individual level, I think we should critique those mistakes. And I wish, I think we should have a more open conversation about those small mistakes. What I'm saying is, in aggregate, it builds to a story about him. And I think he's not going to have that level of analysis about those things. I think he's just not as a politician. And maybe we let him off the hook too easy because we like him and because we see, and look, in many ways, I see the bigger picture with him, right? I care more about Medicare for all and college for all and not giving up on student debt than I do about those other things. But those other things are what, you're right, do somewhat. And I talk about this in the book. In the first chapter, I have that section where I talk about Earl, where I get into a bunch of these things. And I say, there was Bernie, who all of us would publicly go to the ends of the earth for. And there was Earl, who we all have a lot of critiques about. And I run through a bunch of them right in the first prologue.
So Earl, for those who haven't read the book yet, is the name used to reference Senator Sanders in public. So if people are eavesdropping, they're not getting intel on what the goings on of the campaign or what's happening with the candidate. And
it just became I don't even know where it came from, but it became a code word where you're talking, Earl won't prep for the debate. Earl's not listening to this. And I think on those micro things, we have that critique. And I think you're right, Brianna. I think in our heads, we give him a lot more latitude because not only do I respect the positions he takes, I think it is absolutely necessary for this country to have a politician who is advocating for the things he advocates for. I think even post-presidential campaign, look, no other Democrats like to talk about unions. Bernie's the only one actually walking on picket lines. And I think that's important. And maybe that's why we give him a pass on the broader stuff.
It's important. But now that we're having this other conversation, all right, now that the left or some parts of the left are having this other conversation about the utility of continuing to work within the Democratic Party, what it means for a candidate like Bernie Sanders to ultimately serve, wittingly or unwillingly, to validate the Democratic Party apparatus, whether or not ultimately, even if we obviously support and are very excited about his participation in the Amazon Union Drive, for instance, if all of the leaked memo and all of this stuff isn't part and parcel of serving the purpose of reconstituting the left under the umbrella of the Democratic Party, and if Bernie's successes and Bernie's enthusiasm and Bernie's commitment to sincere leftist ideals are ultimately co-opted by the Democratic Party, as some people perceive them to be, there is an interesting question as to whether or not we're all in our continuing, unwavering, uncritical support, not that it's completely uncritical, but support of Bernie Sanders, are being useful idiots in service of that project. I mean, that's, I think, an ongoing question and concern for lots of folks who were very supportive of Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, and I think it's a valid question. And I think each of us, depending on a number of factors, will come down in different places. And I think there's Bernie is, and I think this is something fundamental. He has been for 30 years a member of the Democratic caucus, right? On this participation in the Democratic Party question. He has, since 2016, been a member of Senate leadership. He has been the chair of 2 Senate committees for Democrats. I think it's, I do talk in the book about a former advisor who was really pushing Bernie to just declare himself a Democrat.
Right. That was really interesting because a lot of people were aware of Bernie falling out with the advertising team, the video team that was used in 2016. And there was some critique of the campaign for, why didn't they use them? They were so effective. The America ad with Simon and Garfunkel was so compelling. It was perceived by some Bernie supporters as being an early mistake. But you explain in the book that it was about a desire for Bernie to basically defer to the messaging of the media group as opposed to being Bernie, and that was just a non-starter from the beginning.
Yeah, I think there were numerous steps, and it was a complex relationship, and I don't think there really wasn't like super bad blood because everyone kind of realized it was what was going on. But one of those arguments that went on between Mark especially and Bernie was, should Bernie just declare himself a Democrat? And Mark's argument from a political perspective, which I don't agree with, but do see like his rationale, he was internally consistent in his rationale. I don't agree with that rationale, but at least he wasn't being internally inconsistent in it, was that the Democratic Party, politics is more and more red team, blue team. And if you want to be the blue team captain, you got to put on the blue team jersey, right? And there are a number of voters in the Democratic Party who are not, who you could get if you just put on the blue team jersey and declared yourself a loyal card-carrying member. I think for a number of the rest of us, I saw the fact that I think there were a number of voters who we got simply because he wasn't a Democrat, because he said he was outside the system. And also, my belief was Bernie being Bernie was him being consistent over 30 years. If he suddenly had this glaring inconsistency, where for 30 years he declared himself an independent, and suddenly, before his second presidential run, he changes this fundamental thing about himself, I think you take out that consistency. And I say this in the book. I think one of the things I saw in 2020 that I thought was really fundamental to voters who were voting in the Democratic primary was having a candidate they believed was consistent and not like consistent and true to themselves. And every time a candidate wasn't true to themselves, you saw them just get eviscerate, their support disappear. And the truth is, oddly, the 2 candidates who are kind of most true to themselves and just kind of did their thing were Bernie Sanders and, frankly, Joe Biden, who would say a bunch of things that we hate, but he kind of wouldn't say, I support. He was going to, every other candidate was trying to come up with some reason why their Medicare for All idea was better than Bernie's. Joe Biden was just like, no, I don't support that. Sorry.
Right.
Joe Biden, and he's wrong on that, but he's at least consistent, which I think.
And you also make the point that there were a bunch of events that Joe Biden simply did not have to show up for. And, there was a lot made of Bernie Sanders' performance in front of Black women voters and, his answers on various identity politics issues, but Biden often wouldn't show up to those events. I remember there was also like a human rights campaign event that Bernie got flack for not going to because he went to some other interest group event that had a conflict. And again, there was absolutely no media conversation at all about Joe Biden even showing up to those events, which was interesting.
The Edmund Pettus Bridge thing, where the first year we went like the second day of the campaign, and it was very hard to get to, by the way. It was like, in terms of logistically, it made things very difficult. But Bernie was like, this is important. I'm going to go to it. And there was no, oh, Bernie's like there were like 2 candidates there who were running for president. And then a year later, when it was the day before Super Tuesday, we needed to be in California. Going to Alabama basically meant we couldn't campaign in a bunch of Super Tuesday states. And we decided we had done this event the year before. We're not going to, oh my God, it's the end of the world, because we didn't go to that event where we would get flack, where nobody else would get flack for not going to a bunch of events.
Right. One part that was completely new to me was this conversation, this meeting that Bernie Sanders, yourself, and I think some other staffers had with the Facebook team about algorithmic changes that really significantly impacted the reach of Bernie's kind of online Facebook presence, and the kind of openness with which the Facebook team said that the campaign should basically defer to them as to how they
it wasn't the campaign
package Bernie's message. So go ahead.
It was the Senate office, which made it far worse. So what happened was Bernie had this tremendous rise on Facebook. We had a really successful online video program because Armand is a genius, basically, and drove the work of
Producer Armand, for people who don't know.
Producer Armand is literally a genius, and would literally did the work of that video team of like 10 people in the Senate office. It was one of the most remarkable things I've seen, actually. And we would gain, and Georgia Park, who people don't necessarily know, but kind of did Bernie's social media for years, just brilliant. And we saw our numbers rising. Then one day, literally out of nowhere, and this is the Senate office page, Facebook page, stopped getting followers. And like, it just dead stopped. And we were like, this is strange. And there was a series of meetings with a number of Facebook people, including at one point Adam Mosseri, who now is the head of Instagram, including a phone call with Sheryl Sandberg, where Bernie wanted to address like not what was going on with his Facebook page, but what's going on. How are you deciding what a government office should say to their constituents? And like, it's one thing for like you to decide what corporation should say, but you're suggesting Facebook should be in the middle of a government office and its constituents and how they were deciding who gets what content. And he really was digging in on the algorithm with them. And it was much bigger than his own page. It just, his own page is what caused them to notice it. And at one point they denied there was any change. Then like Georgia had a bunch of charts she printed out with Josh Miller Lewis, and they were like, showed the Facebook guys these charts, and they finally were like, yeah, we flipped a switch and it cut off your supporters basically because of this change. And then there was a meeting post 2018 election, and we had run into some real weird issues in 2018. One of which was that we saw a bunch of pages pop up with paid advertising that were like, Bernie Sanders tells you to not vote for the Democrat, to vote for blah, 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 in a bunch of congressional districts where he did no such thing and made no such announcement about the candidates. And we went to Facebook and we said, hey, these ads are not true. And Facebook initially pulled them down. And then like 3 days before the election, they said, no, these are legit. We're putting them back up. And Vice, because when you put up a political ad, you have to give them information, like address and who's putting it up. Vice, there was no public filings from the group, no FEC filings, which, by the way, Facebook would absolutely know these groups were violating federal election law because they absolutely were exceeding contribution thresholds without any reporting. And Facebook has a record of that. But second, Vice went to the address that the group said was their address, did not exist. Like the address existed, but they went, nobody like that in the buildings. It didn't exist. And Facebook refused to pull these ads down. We had this meeting, and Bernie had just done a town hall with AOC at the time of this meeting. And Bernie had done was doing a town hall with AOC. This is post 2018. And we had this meeting, and they were like, well, and we were asking like why things didn't do better. And the Facebook people were like, well, if you consider doing this issue instead of this issue and how you structure this, and maybe if you talked about this, and Bernie was like, are you telling me you should direct what issues my office talks about? And they were basically like, yes, we should tell you what issues you should talk about. And Bernie got up and just walked out. It was like, you guys deal with this, I'm done. And like walked out of the meeting. I was sitting there, and this Facebook lobbyist turns and goes, your boss is like a miserable old coot. At which point I turn and I say, please leave, like get out. And they're like, what? I was like, you don't get to insult Bernie and Bernie's office. Sorry, you insult Bernie and Bernie's office, you can leave. Like you don't get to do that. And as a way of apologizing, first her boss started being like backing it down and being like, but as a way of apologizing, this person goes, well, I worked for Chuck Schumer and he's a miserable old coot too. And like this level of like ego and disrespect it's pretty remarkable. But the most disrespectful part to me was not that they called Bernie a miserable old coot or Chuck Schumer a miserable old coot. It was that they had this belief that they should be able, because of their position in the marketplace, to literally direct the issues that a Senate office would talk about. And that to me is the grossest thing.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. And people should definitely read this book and to get a full sense of that story and some other really interesting insider tidbits that even as someone who worked in the campaign, I was not aware of. All right, and I know we have to wrap, but I do want to ask you this. Is anyone still talking to Bernie? Is there anybody who's still really in the orbit, or do you have the sense that post-campaign, the people who kind of comprise so much of his daily life are mostly not around anymore? Because it does feel as though he did the one interview with Crystal Ball, but he hasn't been doing the left media circuit. There's the endorsement of S&T, and obviously he's continued to participate in these union actions and things. But it does seem to be a little bit of a black box where even those like yourself who are very intimate with him don't necessarily have a good read on what he's thinking about now, 2 years into the Biden administration, and as we're about to go into this midterm season.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of people still around him that like Warren is still, Gunnels is still running the budget committee and is still doing all that. Casca is in the Senate office. Faz is working on the campaign committee. Misty Rebeck is Iowa director, is his chief of staff. So there are a number of people still around. I think the thing about Bernie is he's very focused and directed on the work. So if you're not day-to-day involved in the work, he kind of doesn't, he had the line to the New York Times, he's not going to call you on your birthday, right? He's not going to call you on your birthday. He's not going to call you just to gossip. He's not going to call you just to chit chat. He's very directed on the work. And if you're not day-to-day involved in his work, he's not going to call you day to day. And I think there are a number of people still around who I presume he does speak to every day, who are involved in the work.
Are you surprised that you don't have as much day-to-day interaction with him as you want?
No, I mean, I made a decision in July of when I was in the Senate office, I obviously did. I had made a decision actually earlier than July. I made a decision in April, May of last year that I had been with him for 4 years, that I needed a break. It's an overwhelming amount of work to serve a principal at that level, meaning, I think you can attest to this. I didn't really have a life of my own, right? My life was whatever Bernie needed at any given moment. And I needed a break for me, for my family, to do other things, to get out on the road and travel myself and do other things. And when I left, we had a very, the goodbye was just exceptionally nice. And like we honestly, the last day in the Senate office, we had a really beautiful conversation about our time together. I had left to go someplace. He called. He's like, you need to come back because I need to talk to you about something. And I was like, oh, what did I forget? And it was he just wanted to chat about what we had experienced together. And it was a really lovely conversation. I've run into him since I left, and the conversations are always very very nice and very kind of back at where we were. Like there's no gap. But Bernie is somebody who, if you're not working for him, doing the day-to-day work, he's focused on that. I'm not focused on that. I made a choice that I didn't want to be focused on that at this moment, that I needed to do something else and move on to do other things. And I think one of the things that's great about Bernie is he is focused on the work. He doesn't want to BS around. And I think that's one of his positives, actually.
Well, few people have spent as much time with the senator as you, Ari, and people should definitely check out The Fighting Soul. Can you tell them where they can find this book?
Literally any bookstore, if you don't want to do Amazon, which is a very understandable thing, you can go to all the IndieBound bookstore, I think bookshop.com, all those indie bookstore sites, Barnes & Noble, if there are books sold, the book is sold there. So you should pick it up.
And it's got, amazing photographs in it. The cover photo you also took, right, Ari, of Bernie Sanders sitting and talking with Jesse Jackson, I believe in Michigan.
Yeah, that was in Michigan on the final day. There's also an amazing picture that's actually my favorite picture. It's the first picture in the photo section. And it was the last day of the campaign. Bernie, we had trying to figure out what's going on with COVID. Are we going to do this next rally? There was 2 hours and we were on the ground. And we didn't know what was going to happen, if there was going to be events in the future. And Bernie decided we would go to 2 museums just because there was an hour to kill. And he went to the Motown Museum and he was sitting in the studio where they did all the recordings, singing My Girl with the tour guide. And it was this remarkable Bernie moment, because it's the thing you never see about Bernie is how much he loves Motown and how much he loves just singing those songs, and how you could see him just taken back to that stage of his childhood, singing that song in that studio. And it was the one time he turned to me and goes, Ari, make sure you take a picture.
Well, on that note, please do follow Ari and follow him on social media, where he is an amazing photographer and you get to see the other part of his personality. Thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you, Brianna.
And for listeners, a reminder that we put out 2 episodes every week. You can get our premium episodes on Monday at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast, or $5 a month. You can access our entire back catalog of, it's got to be, close to 100 episodes at this point. You can watch or listen to the episodes there. I appreciate your support.
I'm a Patreon. Everyone should be.
I love that. I love our making endorsement, Ari. Thank you all, and keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.